really excited by today's guest, mainly because he started at Google and he spent 7.5 years there, where we actually worked very closely with each other in Dublin and in London. So I'm really excited to have him on board. This is Bilal Zaidi. He is the founder of Creator Lab. Creator Lab is a leading business podcast and a digital marketing consultancy. He's been working with startups, Fortune 500 companies. He has been working with the founders and CEOs of companies like Hublot and the Pele Foundation. He has interviewed some of the leading business minds in the world. So excited to hear his thoughts and insight. Bilal, welcome.
Thanks for having me on, man. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, of course. Well, Bilal, like we've known each other for a while, but one thing that I've always seen about you is that you have this like fantastic like entrepreneurial spirit. What is the continuing driving force behind that?
I'd say it probably started from quite a young age because my parents were like immigrant parents. They moved to London when they were quite young, and I was born there. And I guess it just comes from that background. Like they weren't entrepreneurs themselves, but I just always was encouraged to look at investing. Like my dad used to have his spreadsheet open and we would look at shares and stocks together. We'd talk about buying and renting properties and stuff like that. I think it just kind of came from not having too much and wanting to get some extra pocket money. And it really started like in school. So I used to sell like SIM cards and hats and chocolate bars and stuff like that to kids at school. And then eventually graduated to starting an e-commerce business when I was 16. So yeah, that's kind of the background.
Starting an e-commerce business at 16, that's not usually what 16-year-olds are up to. Like,
yeah. But I'd say e-commerce in inverted commas. It was not huge, but it started with me selling stuff on eBay, and then I made my own website, and I sold all around the world and helped me pay for a lot of college, university. But yeah, I definitely didn't become a millionaire from that.
Yeah. That's so fascinating to hear. What, like, as you've kind of progressed, like obviously you're doing consultancy and you've got this fantastic podcast, Creator Lab, which I highly recommend. Like, what are the kind of the challenges that you faced now that you are really going out there in the consultancy world, and what are the challenges that you faced of trying to tell your story and get your message out there?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me has been, when you start anything from zero, like no one knows my name. Not that many people even know my name today. But when you're starting, obviously, you're kind of like tweeting and sharing stuff out into a black hole. And all the people you're sharing out to are just your friends or your family, right? And they might care about you and want to encourage you. Like my mom is my number one listener on the podcast, but ultimately I shouldn't really be making it for her. She's not really my target audience. So that has taken me, a few years to really refine and figure out like who is my target, persona essentially. And basically everyone is not my customer. So that's something I had to get used to. Yeah, and that's probably the biggest challenge so far, and I'm still even now refining that every episode.
And as you're refining that, like you're obviously trying to get these CEOs and these founders to tell their stories. Like, what kind of techniques do you use to really help them tell that story and almost be open and honest with you as you're having that discussion?
Yeah, it definitely takes a lot of practice, and I'm trying to improve that every episode again. But there's probably a few things. One is just they have to trust you, like they know I'm not a traditional journalist. I'm not trying to, I love traditional journalism, but like I'm not a traditional journalist. I'm just like a curious operator, essentially. So they know that I'm just kind of like one of their peers or someone who's interested in doing stuff that they're doing. So I think that helps a lot. They also know that I'm not trying to like get them with something and like get them in trouble, which other people do. So I think that helps building that layer of trust. And then when we're speaking, I try to like prep before. So I have phone calls with them before. I try to give them some sort of understanding of like the style of the show. I try to make it conversational, not like a question answer back and forth. And then the biggest thing that I've kind of learned actually read it in a book. I forgot what it's called. Is it Storyful? It's by the guy who won the Moth competition like 5 or 6 times.
Very worthy.
Storyworthy, that's the one. Sorry, Storyful's like a company. But yeah, so one of the principles he talks about is stories are made up in these 5-second moments. And I really love that, because if I say to someone, like recently I had the co-founder of Square on the show, he's a billionaire, and I could have said, hey, like, you're a billionaire, what's that like, right? That's quite a generic thing. But what I said to him was, well, could you take me back to that moment you became a billionaire, or you remember becoming a billionaire? And that to me was like honing it in, and the person listening is also kind of being transported to that person's mind, and he has to think very specifically, like, where was I when that happened? And he shared a pretty cool moment as well. So I think that really helps, just honing in on specific moments like that.
I love that. And actually, one of the reasons why I love that example is I'm actually interviewing Matt, who wrote Storyworthy, next week.
Oh, no way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, it's a great book.
Perfect
really cool.
timing. It is. And yeah, I like that interview that you did with, the founder of Square was really fascinating, because like, I think the trust that you build with them really does seem to come out. Because like, you're spending like an hour with it, like in these conversations. It's not like what we're doing.
Often 2 hours. Yeah, like I block 2 hours most of the time. Sometimes people don't have 2 hours, so I get what I can take, but I take what I can get. But yeah, I mean, in that specific conversation, like towards the end, not to spoil it for anyone who wants to listen, but he shares something very personal about like the hardest time in his life, and that couldn't have really happened without building up that kind of trust, that he knows that I'm not trying to make fun of him or trying to get something out of him,
And like, for all of the interviews that you've done, you're also doing like consultancy work. And is there anything that you've kind of taken from those interviews, or anything that you've been able to apply then to the consultancy work that helps brands like overcome like common mistakes or challenges?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, it kind of comes back to what I mentioned before about honing in on what's most important. And actually, I learned a lot of this at Google, because Google actually originally was terrible at telling stories, like in the sales teams where we had worked. We would do these data pukes, as Avinash would say, and it would just be numbers all over the place. And actually, Avinash, if people haven't heard of him, he's the guy who wrote Analytics an Hour a Day. He's still at Google, I think. And he's great at storytelling through numbers. And that's a lot of our job, right? Like, you're taking data and you're trying to take out what's most important. And again, honing into that one moment. And I think he did a great job of, like, I did a few trainings with him, and he would just say simple things like, okay, you've got a slide with 17 things on it. Like, you just want one at a time. And the deck shouldn't be there. People shouldn't be able to understand the deck without you there if you're the one presenting it. So that sort of stuff really helped. And again, I guess it comes down to overcomplicating, that's something I'm always trying to improve. Definitely not there yet. I'm trying to simplify where I can. And then I guess the last thing is focusing on, as it relates to consulting specifically, I see a lot of companies, especially startups that I work with, who are like really product focused. And let's say 90% of the organization are engineers and technical people. Similar to me, I want to tell everyone, hey, do you know how hard it was to do this podcast? I recorded for 2 hours and I prepared for 10 hours and we did 10 hours of editing. But the person listening doesn't care. They just want to know, does this help me right now? And similar for companies, you want to tell someone how complicated it was to create this technical revolution that you've got in your mind, but they just want to know, is it better than another product they're using, So that, I think that's something that I've translated from both worlds.
That's fantastic. I do remember the Google days of just trying to put down as many numbers onto a slide as and try to get the pitch in just by saying like, here's X, Y, Z, A, B, C, everything that you should do, and all those things that's going to happen, without actually even saying like, hey, like, what are your objectives? Like, what would you like to achieve with us? Those seem a long
definitely.
time ago.
Yeah. And actually, just you kind of touched on it there, but like, if you see a pitch or a presentation or a marketing, anything you're doing, like I said as a joke the other day, life's a pitch. And it kind of is, because like, you're either, especially if you're an entrepreneur, like, you're constantly pitching, investors, customers, employees to join you, guests for my podcast. It's always a pitch. And essentially, like, people take in the world through stories. So stories have a beginning, middle, and end. It doesn't mean it has to be in that sequence, though. So I think that's another thing. Sometimes in a presentation or a podcast, I'll just pick a moment. Like, there was an interview I did with a guy called Fabrice Grinda who bought an island, right? Like, I'm not going to meet many people in the world who've bought an island. So instead of explaining who he is and all the impressive stuff he's done, we just started talking about buying an island. And you kind of get people into the zone and they're like, well, who's this guy? And then you can tell the start of the story later, if that makes sense.
Of course, yeah. And you see it often as well, like within like some of the Dragon's Den, like, or Shark Tank, if you ever watch them, where they almost like start their story at the end. It's like they kind of say, like, here's what this looks like when everything works out perfectly, and then they kind of work backwards from there. So I totally agree with you on that. There's one thing as well that you really like honed in on, the powers of story there, and just how inspiring some of these founders and CEOs can be. Like, what are the kind of things that you look for in those kind of CEOs and founders that say, oh, I need to interview this guy, I need to get this person on my show?
Yeah, I guess because I'm quite a curious person, so I'm generally like, I could probably find something I want to learn from almost anyone. But for the sake of the podcast, I've had to filter things through. So one is, I have to think, like, has this person done something I can learn from? Or are they just like talking about theory? You know what I mean? And that's just a personal preference. I think, for example, academics have a lot of theory and it's great. But that's not what my focus is. My focus is on people, especially for business, because business, you're learning kind of in the trenches. You're like, what you learn at university. I studied business and economics. Like, it's so much of it is so outdated, right? But someone who's working on something today, I can actually understand specifically what's going on in their world. So that's one big focus. And for me, it's really just someone who's lived an interesting life, because it's not just about money and business and all that stuff. It's like, are they interesting? Are they entertaining? Are they someone I'd want to hang out with? And because a lot of the reason I do this is to build relationships with good people, because I think that compounds over a long life, and that's just kind of part of the fun of doing it. So I have to think, is there something in it for me? And of course, I'd love for them to be like an expert in some sort of field, because I want someone who's listening to learn from it as well.
I love that. And when it comes to, learning from it, like, you yourself are also, a consultant, as we mentioned. And throughout your like career, and whether it be at Google or whether it be with Creator Lab, like, what's your favorite story of somebody taking something that you've either done or an insight that you've offered them, and them taking that on and seeing success from it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's weird, because there's been so many different times where I felt like valued, and like, oh, we talked about this thing and they did it, and sometimes it made them millions and millions of dollars, and I didn't get any of it, but it was nice to see. But I think the one that really stands out to me is actually from some time ago. I forgot the guy's name, to be honest, because it was like more than 5 years ago. I think his name was Dave as well, actually. But he was an ex-engineer. Like, I think he worked for Rolls-Royce or something. And he started like a beauty brand, right? So he had like an e-commerce business selling men's and women's beauty products. And it was completely like not what he was interested in, but he landed into it. And he was just selling in the UK at the time. And at the time, we were kind of doing a lot of keyword research through Google and figuring out like, where is there demand for your products outside of the UK? And long story short, I did some analysis and found there were like 45 different countries he could be exporting to. And I showed it to him and he was like, oh, this is interesting, cool. And then a few weeks later, because I was talking directly to the decision maker, he just made it happen. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but it like doubled or tripled their revenue in a short period of time. So I remember that, and I kind of wonder where that guy is now, but it was really cool to see it working just with a flip of a switch.
That is actually really cool. You never know, he may be listening and might like actually like.
He's probably on my LinkedIn, so when I share this, he maybe will see it and he can message me. But
Amazing. Well, I know that you're exceptionally busy. Just one last question from me. What is next for Bilal?
Don't know, man. I wouldn't say I have a big master plan. I'm just really focused on what I'm doing right now, which is trying to have good conversations, meet good people, keep learning. I'm self-employed full time for almost 2 years now, so it's allowed me to have a lot more of a flexible life, which I really like. But I guess now everyone's kind of doing that anyway because of the current situation. So yeah, I think I'll continue trying to grow what I'm doing and help people learn from what I'm learning as well.
Excellent. I love that. And we're going to link to your podcast like in the description of this video. I highly, highly recommend, like, especially if you're even just fresh out of college or have any interest in like people that are entrepreneurial. There's so many great insights. And as Bilal mentioned, like these are long conversations where you just find some fantastic snippets of information, stuff that you won't get from like a Forbes article, a write up about somebody. These are very personal, authentic conversations. So definitely recommend everybody watching this subscribe. With that, Bilal, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Dave, man. We got to hang out when we're able to again as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely.